The Mafia boss had come home earlier than usual when he suddenly stopped outside the bathroom. A little girl, no older than 5, was quietly struggling to wash his shirts in a small plastic basin with her tiny hands. Water splashed across the floor as she nervously scrubbed each piece of clothing, trembling the moment she realized he was standing there. Every bodyguard froze, expecting their ruthless boss to explode in anger. Instead, he stood motionless, as the frightened child looked up and whispered, "P, please, don't fire my mommy. She's sick, so I'm washing your clothes for her." In that single moment, the icy heart of the most feared Mafia boss in the city began to crack, setting in motion a chain of events that would uncover a secret powerful enough to shake his entire empire. Alessandro Moretti was 38 years old, and for the past 8 years, he had been the most powerful man in New York City. His name alone could silence a room. His signature could move millions of dollars across 3 continents before the ink had dried. The Moretti family, the oldest and most feared of the 5 great families, bowed to him not out of love, but out of a fear so deep it had become a religion. But he had not been born to this throne. Once, there had been Antonio. Antonio Moretti, his older brother by 6 years, had been everything Alessandro was not. Warm where Alessandro was cold. Trusting where Alessandro was suspicious. Antonio had believed that a family could be built on loyalty rather than terror, and for a while, the whole world had believed him. Then, on a cold October evening 8 years ago, Antonio had been shot 4 times in the back of the head, inside a small restaurant in Little Italy, by a man he had called his best friend for 20 years, a man he had trusted with the keys to his home, a man who had held Alessandro on his shoulders when Alessandro was still a boy in short pants. Alessandro had arrived at the scene 20 minutes too late. He had knelt in his brother's blood, his knees soaking through the fabric of a $1,000 suit, and he had made himself a promise that would come to define the rest of his life. Never again would he trust. Never again would he love something that could be taken from him. Never again would he leave a debt of blood unpaid. By dawn the next morning, the man who had killed Antonio was floating face down in the East River, and Alessandro Moretti, 30 years old, his hands still stained with a brother's blood he had never fully washed off, had become the head of the family. From that day forward, he lived by 3 rules, engraved into his bones like scripture. Trust no one. Loyalty always has a price. Betrayal is always paid in blood. His empire grew. His enemies vanished. His name became a whisper in every corner of the underworld, from Brooklyn to Sicily. And his mansion, a great pale house on a hill in Long Island, with 20 rooms and 40 guards patrolling the grounds day and night, became the throne room of a king who ruled entirely alone. No wife waited for him at the door. No children ran to greet him in the marble foyer. No lover shared his enormous bed. There were only the guards, the staff, and the long, echoing hallways that carried the sound of his footsteps back to him like a mockery. He had money he could never spend in 10 lifetimes. He had power most men could not even imagine. And yet, somewhere in the center of his chest, there lived a cold stone that no wealth could warm, a tiredness that no sleep could touch. It sat there year after year, quiet and heavy, and Alessandro had long ago accepted it as the price of the crown. That morning, the meeting of the 5 great families had ended earlier than expected. The old dons had agreed on the new territory lines with surprising ease, and by 10:30, Alessandro was standing on the marble steps of the meeting hall in Midtown, watching his driver pull the black armored car around. He did not call his household. He did not warn the staff. He did not tell his second-in-command where he was going. He simply told the driver, in a voice quieter than usual, to take him home. While Alessandro's black car cut its way through the morning traffic of Manhattan, back at the great pale house on the hill, a woman named Sofia Ramirez was already fighting a war of her own. She was 32 years old, small in stature but with the kind of quiet strength that only mothers who have raised a child entirely alone seem to carry. For more than 3 years now, she had worked in the Moretti mansion as its housekeeper, not one of many, but the only one. The only person Alessandro trusted enough to allow into the private wing of his home. The only person who had ever touched his personal belongings without being watched by a camera. She had earned that trust the hard way by asking no questions, by seeing nothing she was not meant to see, by hearing conversations behind closed doors and forgetting them the moment the doors opened again. In the world of the Moretti family, silence was a currency more valuable than gold, and Sofia had learned to spend it wisely. Her life had not always been quiet. Once, she had believed in love the way young women in poor neighborhoods sometimes still do. She had married a man who promised her the world, and for a little while, she had believed him. Then, the day she came home and told him she was pregnant, he had looked at her the way a man looks at a debt he does not want to pay. 3 weeks later, She had woken up in an empty apartment with a note on the table and no money in the bank. She had raised her daughter alone from that day forward. Emma was 5 years old now. She had her mother's soft brown curls and her mother's enormous dark eyes that seemed too large for such a small face, that took in everything and forgot nothing. She was a shy child, the kind who hid behind her mother's skirt whenever a stranger came near, who spoke only in whispers to people she did not know. In the 3 years Sophia had worked at the mansion, Alessandro had seen the little girl perhaps 6 or 7 times, always in passing, always half hidden in the folds of Sophia's uniform. He had never spoken a word to her. He would not have known how. The two of them lived in a small cottage at the far end of the estate, tucked behind a row of tall hedges where the great house could not see them. It was a modest place, but Sophia kept it as clean and warm as any palace. In Alessandro's world of blood and gunpowder and cold marble floors, there was no room for a child's laughter, and so Sophia had made sure her daughter's laughter stayed hidden, behind the hedges, where it could not disturb the master of the house. That morning, however, the laughter had gone silent. Sophia had woken at 4 in the morning with a fever that felt as though someone had lit a fire inside her skull. By 6, the thermometer had climbed past 104 degrees. By 7, she could no longer stand. She lay in her small bed, drenched in sweat, whispering to her daughter through cracked lips that she would be all right in just a little while, that she only needed to rest. But Emma had heard her mother say, again and again, over the past 3 years, one sentence more important than any other: "We must always keep Mr. Alessandro's clothes clean, darling. That is how Mama keeps our home." And so, while her mother slept, the little girl slipped out of the cottage in her nightdress and began dragging the heavy basins of unwashed laundry, one by one, toward the main house. The silence in the doorway of the bathroom lasted perhaps 5 seconds. To Alessandro, it felt like an entire hour. Behind him, Rico Petrov, the head of his personal security detail, a mountain of a man who had served the Moretti family for over a decade, took a single, sharp step forward. His hand had already moved to the little girl's arm, ready to lift her out of the bathroom the way one might remove a stray animal from a formal dining room. It was instinct. It was protocol. Anything unexpected in the master's private quarters was to be dealt with immediately. But Alessandro raised one hand just barely, just an inch, and Rico froze in place as though he had been struck. "Leave her," Alessandro said quietly. His voice was not angry. That was what unsettled every man in the hallway more than anything else. In the 8 years they had served him, they had heard him give orders that ended lives. They had heard him laugh, cold and short, before doing terrible things. But they had never, not once, heard him speak in the tone he was using now. It was the tone of a man who had forgotten, for a moment, that he was supposed to be dangerous. Alessandro stepped forward, past the puddle of soapy water, and lowered himself onto one knee in front of the trembling child. His custom Italian trousers pressed into the wet tile, and he did not care. His polished shoes soaked through at the toes, and he did not notice. He knelt down until his eyes were level with hers, an act he had not performed for another human being since he was a boy at his mother's grave. Emma flinched. Tears spilled over her lower lashes and rolled down her round cheeks in fat, silent drops. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her small chest heaving. "I made the floor all wet. Please don't hit my mama. I'll clean it up, I promise. I'll clean everything." Alessandro's hands, the same hands that had, without hesitation, pulled the trigger on 11 men over the past 8 years, trembled slightly as they reached out and took her tiny fingers into his own. They were red from the cold water, and they were shaking, and they were unimaginably small inside his palms. "No one is going to hit your mother," he said softly. "No one is going to hit anyone. Look at me, little one. Look at me." She raised her enormous dark eyes to his face, and he felt something inside his chest crack quietly, almost politely. The way old glass cracks when it has been under too much pressure for too long. "How long has your mother been sick?" he asked. Emma held up one small hand and began to count, carefully, on her fingers. 1, 2, 3. She showed him the 3 little fingers, still red from the cold water, still trembling. 3 days now, she whispered. Something twisted violently inside him. 3 days. 3 days. A woman had been lying sick, feverish, alone in a cottage on his own property, and he had not known, because she had not wanted to bother him, because she had told her daughter, "Mr. Alessandro is very busy. We mustn't disturb him." He turned his head sharply. His voice, when it came, was low and absolutely cold. "Rico, call Dr. Bianchi. I want him here in 15 minutes. Then he slid one arm beneath the little girl's knees, one arm around her small back, and lifted her against his chest, the first child he had ever held in his entire life. and walked out of the bathroom, straight down the marble hallway, straight through the back garden, straight toward the small cottage behind the tall hedges. The path to the cottage was longer than Alessandro remembered. He had ordered its construction 3 years ago, when he had first hired Sofia, and he had signed the papers without ever setting foot on the site. He had never once walked this path. He had never thought to. Now, with Emma light and warm in his arms, her small head tucked against his shoulder, he counted every step. The cottage stood at the far end of the property, half hidden behind the tall hedges he had once ordered planted for privacy. He had assumed, in the vague way that rich men assume such things, that his housekeeper lived comfortably. He had paid her well. He had built her a house on his own land. What more could a woman like her possibly need? But when he pushed open the wooden door and stepped inside, something inside him went very still. The cottage was small, smaller than any of the dressing rooms in his mansion. A single bedroom, a narrow kitchen, a tiny sitting area with one worn armchair. Everything was scrupulously clean. Everything was arranged with painful care. A vase of wildflowers, hand-picked, sat on the tiny wooden table. A child's drawing was taped to the refrigerator. A single, framed photograph of Sofia and Emma hung above the couch, the only decoration in the entire home. It was the home of a woman who had made a great deal out of very little, and who had never asked for more. Alessandro felt a heat rise in his face that he could not name. Shame, perhaps. He had not felt it in so many years he no longer recognized it. He carried Emma to the small bedroom and stopped in the doorway. Sofia lay curled on her side on the narrow bed, wrapped in a thin blanket, her dark hair damp against her forehead. Her face was the color of old paper. Her lips were cracked. Her breathing came in short, painful little pulls, and each one seemed to cost her something she did not have to give. At the sound of the door, her eyes fluttered open, and when she saw who was standing there, the color that had been missing from her face for 3 days came flooding back in one great, terrified wave. "Mr. Alessandro." She tried to sit up. She made it halfway before her arms gave out beneath her, and she collapsed back onto the pillow with a small, broken sound. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I'll come to work now. I promise. I just need one moment. Please, please don't. Lie still." 2 words. Spoken softly, almost gently, Sofia stopped breathing for a moment, staring at him. In 3 years, she had never once heard him use that voice. Dr. Bianchi arrived 11 minutes later, his black bag in hand. He examined Sofia in silence for perhaps 5 minutes, listened to her lungs, checked her temperature, pressed his fingers against her wrist. Then he stood up and looked at Alessandro with the grim professional calm of a man who had delivered many such verdicts. "Acute pneumonia. She should have been in a hospital 2 days ago. She needs to be admitted immediately." Sofia's eyes filled. No, sir, please. I don't have insurance. I can't afford transfer her to Mount Sinai," Alessandro said, cutting her off. His voice had returned to the tone. His men knew the tone that ended arguments. "The private wing. I will cover everything, every dollar." He looked down at Emma, who had climbed onto the bed and was clutching a fistful of her mother's blanket, crying without making a sound. "The child stays with me in the main house," he said quietly, "until her mother is well." Sofia's tears finally spilled over, and for the first time in her small life, Emma looked up at the terrifying man from the great house, and her eyes held no fear at all. The ambulance pulled away from the estate just before noon, its blue lights spinning silently against the pale sky. Sofia had held her daughter's face between her feverish hands for a long moment before they took her, whispering something Alessandro could not hear. Whatever it was, Emma had nodded very seriously, the way small children nod when they have been given a task they intend to keep forever. Then the door had closed, and the little girl had been left standing alone on the great gravel driveway, holding a small canvas bag that contained everything she had thought to bring: a change of clothes, a plastic hairbrush, and a threadbare stuffed bear whose left ear had been sewn back on more times than she could count. Alessandro looked down at her. She looked up at him, and for perhaps the first time in his adult life, he did not know what to do next. He had ordered generals killed with less hesitation. He turned to Rico. "The sitting room next to my study. Prepare it for her. Send someone into the city. I want proper things for a child. A bed, sheets with something on them, whatever children like. Books, whatever a 5-year-old girl needs. I want it here before nightfall." Rico had served him for 11 years. He had never once, in all that time, questioned an order. He did not question this one either, but something flickered across his hard face that might, in another man, have been called a smile. By evening, the sitting room had been transformed. A small white bed with a soft pink coverlet, a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon, A shelf of picture books someone had frantically purchased from 3 different stores in Manhattan. It was more furniture than a child could possibly use, and it was, Alessandro realized as he stood in the doorway, still not enough. Nothing here could replace what she had lost that day. Emma sat in the exact center of the enormous new bed, her small legs folded beneath her. The ragged stuffed bear clutched against her chest with both arms. The room dwarfed her. Everything in the entire house dwarfed her. At 7 o'clock, the housekeeping staff brought dinner up on a silver tray, a small bowl of chicken soup, warm bread, sliced fruit. They set it on the little table beside her bed and left. Half an hour later, when Alessandro came to check, the soup had not been touched. He sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. It creaked under his weight in a way that made Emma flinch. "You need to eat, little one." Emma stared down at her lap. She spoke so quietly he almost missed the words. "I'm not allowed to eat Mr. Alessandro's food." Something in the center of his chest twisted so hard he had to breathe through it. 5 years old, and she had already learned to make herself small. To take up as little of the world as possible. To eat as little as possible. To ask for nothing. He stood up without a word, walked down the great marble staircase, took the tray from the kitchen counter himself, and carried it back up 2 flights of stairs with his own hands. When he sat down beside her again and lifted the spoon toward her mouth, his voice was very soft. "Eat. From tonight on, this is your home too." She ate slowly, one careful spoonful at a time, glancing up at him between each one, as though she expected the food to be taken away. Later, much later, past midnight, he stood outside her closed door in the darkened hallway, listening to the small, muffled sound of a child crying for her mother. His hand hovered over the doorknob. It stayed there for a very long time. He did not know how to open it. Alessandro did not sleep that night. He sat in the leather armchair in his study until the sky outside the tall windows began to turn the color of old pearls, listening to the silence of a house that suddenly seemed unbearably empty. At 5:30 in the morning, he stood up, walked down the long hallway in his stocking feet, and did something he had never done in the entire history of his adult life. He went to clean a bathroom, the bathroom where, one day earlier, a 5-year-old girl had stood on trembling legs and tried to wash the shirts of the most feared man in New York. The water on the floor had dried, but the tile was still dull with soap streaks. A small plastic stool, the one Emma must have dragged in from the garden, sat abandoned by the basin. The laundry basin itself still held a shallow pool of gray water, and inside it, half submerged like drowned birds, floated the clothes she had tried so hard to clean. He knelt down slowly on the cold tile and began, one item at a time, to pull them out. A pair of trousers she could never have lifted, 2 undershirts, 3 pairs of socks, a silk pocket square she had clearly not known what to do with, and, at the bottom of the basin, waterlogged and heavy, a white dress shirt. The white dress shirt, the one he had worn 2 mornings ago, to the meeting of the 5 great families. He lifted it out, he wrung the water gently from the sleeves, and then, as he began to fold the collar into place, something caught his eye. A single thread, along the underside of the collar, bunched slightly, out of line with the rest of the stitching. Alessandro Moretti stopped moving. For 8 years, he had lived by his instincts. Instincts had saved his life more times than he cared to count. Instincts had told him, one October evening long ago, that his brother should not have gone to that restaurant alone, and he had ignored them, and he had paid for that mistake every day since. He had promised himself he would never ignore them again. He carried the shirt to his study. He locked the door behind him, a thing he almost never did in his own house. He laid the wet fabric flat across his desk, turned on the lamp, and bent low over the collar. The stitching was wrong. Not in the obvious way, not to any eye that had not spent a lifetime learning to notice what was out of place. But the machine-perfect line of factory thread along the underside of the collar had been broken, cut, opened, and then closed again by hand. Whoever had done it was skilled. The stitch length was almost identical. The thread color was almost identical. Almost. Alessandro reached into the top drawer of his desk and drew out a small folding knife. His fingers were absolutely steady now. Carefully, delicately, he slid the tip beneath the stitching and drew it along the seam. The thread parted. A small pocket opened inside the fabric. Inside that pocket lay a micro SD card, black, barely larger than his thumbnail, utterly silent. He stared at it for a long moment before he touched it. Then, he pulled his private laptop from the drawer, the one that had never been connected to any network, the one whose existence not even Rico knew about, and slid the card into the reader. Files began to appear. Audio recordings, photographs of bank statements, Scanned pages of shipping manifests, grainy stills from a hidden camera, dates, account numbers, routing paths through offshore shell companies. Alessandro clicked through them one at a time. His face did not change, his breathing did not change. But somewhere deep inside his chest, the cold stone that had lived there for 8 years began, very slowly, to sink. Every single piece of evidence pointed to one name, Marco Rossi. For the next 3 hours, Alessandro did not move from his desk. He opened each file, one at a time, and studied it with the focus of a man reading his own death sentence. The first was an audio file, 12 minutes long. It began with the hiss of a poor connection, and then 2 voices, one of them belonging to Don Salvatore Bruno, head of the Bruno family, the oldest and most venomous of the Moretti's rivals. The other voice, low and careful, spoke in the unmistakable cadence of a man Alessandro had known for 12 years, a man whose voice he could have picked out of 1,000 in a dark room. Marco Rossi. The conversation was about shipping routes, about guard rotations, about which nights of the week the docks at Red Hook ran short-staffed. Marco was giving the answers. Bruno was writing them down. Alessandro closed the audio file. His hands did not shake. He opened the next one. Bank statements. An offshore account in the Cayman Islands, registered to a shell company that traced back, through 4 layers of paperwork, to the name Marco Rossi. $5 million had been deposited across the past 18 months, in payments too regular to be coincidence. The next file, shipping manifests, marked in red ink. The 3 routes the Moretti family used to move product between New Jersey and Boston, routes that only 6 men in the entire world were supposed to know. Marco had been one of them. The next. Photographs. Grainy. Taken from a long distance through a restaurant window on a rainy night. A man in a dark coat, seated across a small table from Don Bruno. His face was turned away from the camera, but the shape of his shoulders, the way he held his cigarette between his second and third fingers, Alessandro knew that shape. He had been staring at it for 12 years. He sat back in his chair. He looked up at the ceiling of his study, at the elaborate plasterwork he had commissioned from an Italian craftsman when he had first inherited the house, and he waited for the fury to come. It did not come. What came instead was something colder and much, much worse. It was memory. Marco Rossi, 5 years ago, in a warehouse in Brooklyn, throwing himself in front of a bullet that had been meant for Alessandro's chest and taking it through his own shoulder. Marco Rossi, 8 years ago at the funeral of Antonio Moretti, the only man in the entire cathedral who had wept openly, who had walked up to Alessandro afterwards and pressed his forehead against Alessandro's and whispered, "He was my brother too." Marco Rossi, at every meeting, at every meal, at every crisis, standing one step behind Alessandro's right shoulder like a second heart. Marco Rossi, whom Alessandro, who had sworn never to love anything again, had quietly, in the private country of his own mind, called little brother. Alessandro closed the laptop. He stood up. He walked to the window of his study, which looked out across the East River toward the great glittering skyline of Manhattan, and he pressed one hand flat against the cold glass. 2 questions were burning inside his skull, and neither of them was the one his men would have expected. The first was not, "How could Marco do this to me?" The first was, "Who put this card in my collar?" Someone had opened his shirt. Someone had sewn a memory card into his clothing. Someone had wanted him to find this and had trusted, or gambled, that he would find it before anyone else did. Was it a warning from an ally who could not speak openly? Or was it bait from an enemy who wanted him to reach the wrong conclusion and to swing his own sword at his own throat? For the first time in 8 years, Alessandro Moretti stood in the center of his empire and felt, quite genuinely, that he did not know which direction to face. In the days that followed, 2 lives began to run in parallel inside the great pale house on the hill. In one life, Alessandro Moretti was a man hunting a shadow. He spent his mornings locked in the study, listening to recordings, tracing account numbers, comparing dates and locations against every trip Marco had taken over the past 2 years. He spoke to no one about what he had found. He trusted no one to know. Not yet. In the other life, he was simply Uncle Ale. Emma had started calling him that on the second morning. She had come padding into the dining room in the enormous new nightgown. Someone had bought her a nightgown 3 sizes too large, trailing on the marble floor behind her like a wedding train, and she had climbed onto the chair opposite him and said, quite matter-of-factly, "Good morning, Uncle Ale." He had opened his mouth to correct her. Then he had closed it again. By the 3rd morning, the entire staff of the house was using the phrase behind his back carefully, in whispers, half in disbelief. Uncle Ale, Uncle Ale. The most feared name in the New York underworld, softened by a 5-year-old into something you might say to a favorite relative at a Sunday dinner. She followed him everywhere. She had discovered that his study had a very soft rug in front of the fireplace, and she took to lying on her stomach there while he worked, coloring in books with a serious little frown, occasionally lifting her head to ask him questions no one had ever thought to ask him before. "Uncle Ale, do you have any friends?" He had stopped typing. He had stared at the screen for a long moment, then turned his chair slowly toward her. "I have people who work for me," he said carefully. Emma had considered this with great gravity, chewing on the end of her crayon. "That's not the same," she said finally, and went back to her drawing. He had not been able to type another word for nearly an hour. She shared things with him. Small, sacred, 5-year-old things. Half of her afternoon biscuit, broken very carefully into 2 uneven pieces, so that he received the larger one. "Mama says you have to share with people you love," she informed him solemnly, and handed him the piece as though it were a great treasure. He had not eaten a biscuit in perhaps 15 years. He ate that one. She brought him picture books. She placed them in his lap without asking, and on the 4th evening, Rico Petrov walked past the open door of the sunroom and stopped so abruptly that the guard behind him nearly collided with his back. Inside the sunroom, in the last golden light of the afternoon, Alessandro Moretti, the man whose name had ordered the deaths of 11 men, was sitting on a low couch with a 5-year-old child tucked under his arm, reading aloud, in a slow and slightly awkward voice, the story of the ugly duckling. Rico did not move for a full minute. Then, very quietly, he walked away and told no one what he had seen. Across the house, the staff began to whisper. The cook whispered to the gardener. The gardener whispered to the driver. The driver whispered to Rico. For the first time in 8 years, the master of the Moretti mansion had been seen smiling. Not the thin, cold smile his men knew, but a real one, the kind that reached the eyes. Late that night, the phone in the sitting room rang. Sophia, calling from her hospital bed. Emma seized the receiver with both small hands and shouted joyfully into it, "Mama! Mama! I'm staying with Uncle Ale. Uncle Ale is so nice, Mama." Alessandro stood by the window, listening, and somewhere inside his chest, the cold stone that had lived there for 8 years began, very quietly, to warm. In an empire of blood and shadow, the laughter of one small child had become the only remaining fire. But warmth, in the Moretti Empire, could never live for long without the shadow finding it. On the 7th night after the memory card had been found, Alessandro summoned the inner council. The call went out at 9:30 in the evening, through the coded channels reserved for matters that could not wait until morning. Within 2 hours, 4 black cars had rolled through the front gates of the estate, and the 4 capos of the Moretti family, along with the 3 surviving elders of the old generation, had gathered in the private meeting room on the 2nd floor of the mansion. Emma was already asleep. Alessandro had checked twice. He had asked Rico personally to stand outside her door. Then he had walked down the long marble staircase and closed the double doors of the meeting room behind him, with the sound of a coffin sealing shut. The men around the long walnut table were not fools. They could feel it in the air the moment he entered. Something had happened. Something that concerned all of them. He did not sit down. He walked to the head of the table, opened a black leather folder, and began, in a quiet and completely even voice, to lay out what he had found. The recordings, played through the small speaker at the center of the table. The bank statements, printed and slid across the polished wood one by one. The shipping manifests. The photographs from the restaurant on that rainy night. By the time he had finished, the room had gone so still that the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel sounded like a hammer. Don Vittorio, 70 years old, the eldest of the elders, a man who had served Alessandro's father before Alessandro was born, brought his palm down on the table so hard that the water glasses jumped. "Kill him," he said. His voice was low and absolute. "Tonight. This is omerta, boy. This is the law of the family. There is no discussion." The 4 capos began to speak at once, and every one of them was in agreement. 12 years of service meant nothing against evidence like this. $5 million in an offshore account meant nothing but treason. If Marco Rossi were allowed to live even one more day, the entire family would look weak. Weakness invited war. War invited death. "Execute him," said Capo Ferraro. "Tonight," said Capo Bianchi. "Before he knows, we know," said Capo Marchetti. Alessandro did not answer. He stood at the head of the table, his hands resting lightly on the leather folder, and he did not answer, because in the private country of his own mind, another set of images was playing. Marco, 12 years ago, a skinny young man from a poor neighborhood in Queens, walking into the Moretti compound for the first time with his cap in his hand. Marco, 10 years ago, driving Alessandro through a blizzard for 6 hours to reach Antonio in a hospital upstate. Marco, 5 years ago in Brooklyn, the sound of the gunshot, the terrible warmth of another man's blood soaking through Alessandro's own shirt, a bullet meant for his chest, absorbed instead into a shoulder that still bore the scar today. Marco, at Antonio's grave, whispering, "He was my brother too. 12 years of blood, 12 years of sweat, 12 years of a loyalty that had never once cracked." The instinct that had kept Alessandro alive for 8 years was screaming at him not that Marco was innocent, exactly, but that something in this picture was too clean, too perfect. Evidence this complete, delivered this conveniently, sewn into a shirt for him to find. It felt less like a discovery and more like a stage that had been set. From the corner of the room, a smooth voice spoke. "Don Alessandro, the evidence is beyond doubt. To hesitate now is to invite disaster." Alessandro turned his head, slowly. Luca Ricci, the family's chief financial advisor, standing just behind Don Vittorio's chair, where he always stood, met his gaze with calm, respectful eyes. And for just a fraction of a second, so brief that a lesser man would have missed it entirely, Alessandro caught something behind those eyes that did not match the words, something hungry. He did not react. He simply looked at Luca for one long moment more, and then looked away. Then he closed the leather folder, and he spoke, quietly, to the whole room. "Evidence can be manufactured. 12 years of blood and sweat cannot." The meeting broke up shortly before dawn. The elders left angry. The capos left uneasy. Don Vittorio, at the door, turned to Alessandro one last time and said, in a voice like sandpaper, "You have your father's heart, boy. Pray it does not become his tombstone." Alessandro said nothing. He watched the black cars roll back out through the gates. Then he went upstairs, opened Emma's door just wide enough to see her sleeping curled around her stuffed bear, and closed it again without a sound. He did not sleep that night either. By morning, he had made his decision. He would not touch Marco. Not yet. He would keep him exactly where he had been for 12 years, one step behind his right shoulder, at every meeting, at every meal, at every crisis. If Marco truly was the traitor, then the closest place was also the safest place to watch him. And if Marco was not the traitor, then the closest place was the safest place to protect him. But he would investigate. Quietly. Personally. With men he would trust with his own life. He chose 3. The first was Rico Petrov himself, the head of security, whose loyalty had been tested in ways no bank account could ever purchase. The second was an old accountant named Silvio, who had worked for Antonio before Antonio had died, and who had refused every offer from every rival family in the 8 years since. The third was a young technician named Enzo, quiet and clever, whose only weakness in the world was a mother in Sicily whom Alessandro had been paying to keep alive for the past 4 years. He gave the 3 of them a single instruction: "Find me the truth. I don't care what it is. I only care that it is real." They worked for 11 days, and with each day that passed, the picture grew worse. Marco's bank records showed nothing suspicious on the surface, but Silvio, going back through 7 years of statements, found small movements. Cash withdrawals just under the reporting threshold, purchases in cities Marco had no business visiting. A pattern too careful to be an accident. Marco's travel logs matched the timing of the recordings on the memory card, every one of them. Then came worse news. On the 8th night of the investigation, a warehouse in New Jersey, a warehouse whose location was known to only 6 men in the entire Moretti family, was raided by the FBI. 200 kilograms of product, gone. 4 soldiers arrested. Marco had been one of the 6. On the 9th night, an arms shipment worth $8 million was intercepted at the Canadian border. The route had been designed personally by Marco Rossi. On the 10th night, Vincenzo Marco's most trusted lieutenant, a man who had walked one step behind Marco for 10 years, the way Marco walked one step behind Alessandro, simply disappeared. His car was found in a parking lot in Queens. His phone was found in the river. His body was found nowhere. By the 11th morning, the elders were no longer whispering. Don Vittorio came to the mansion in person, alone, and told Alessandro to his face that if he did not act within the week, the elders would call for a vote of no confidence, and if that vote passed, Alessandro would no longer be the head of anything. Alessandro listened. He said nothing. He walked the old man to the door. That evening, Sofia came back from the hospital. She was thinner, her cheeks were still hollow, but she was upright, and she was breathing, and when Emma flew into her arms in the front hallway, she wept as though she had been holding those tears for the entire 2 weeks. Alessandro had prepared a proper room for her in the main house, over her protests. She was not to work for at least another month, he told her. She was to rest. She agreed only because she was too tired to argue. That night, walking past the study door with a glass of warm milk for Emma, she heard him inside speaking quietly to Rico, going over yet another file. She stopped. She listened. She heard the name Marco Rossi. Later, when Rico had gone, she stood in the doorway with the milk still in her hands, and she said very softly, "Sir, are you certain? If Mr. Marco has truly betrayed you." Alessandro looked up at her from behind his desk. On the desk beside him lay an old photograph, a photograph he had taken from a drawer that morning and had not put away since. It showed two young men in ill-fitting suits, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at something outside the frame. Antonio on the left, Marco on the right. 12 years ago, before any of this, he did not answer her. He simply looked down at the photograph, and he would not make himself believe. Sophia recovered slowly, but she recovered. The color came back to her cheeks. Her voice grew steady again. By the end of the second week, she was moving through the house with the quiet grace Alessandro remembered from before her illness. She tried, at first, to return to her work. He would not allow it, not yet. Instead, he had a small sitting area arranged for her in the sunroom, and he asked her to do nothing more strenuous than read or watch her daughter play. She thanked him with tears in her eyes, again and again, until he finally, quietly, asked her to stop. He did not know how to hear such gratitude. It cost him something every time. Emma, meanwhile, had claimed the run of the mansion as her own private kingdom. She had a bedroom that could have housed a family of 4. She had toys arriving from Manhattan every second day. She had a cook who made her small heart-shaped pancakes every morning, and she had, above all else, unfettered access to the study of Uncle Ale. She came in whenever she pleased. She lay on the fireplace rug. She colored. She narrated long, involved stories about her stuffed bear, whose name, she had informed him with great seriousness, was Mr. Buttons. Alessandro had learned to work around her the way a man learns to work around a beloved cat. On the 15th evening, 12 days after the memory card, 4 days after Sophia's return, Emma wandered into the study just before bedtime, dressed in a pink nightgown with rabbits on it, and climbed up into the tall leather chair opposite his desk. She sat there for a moment, swinging her small legs, and then her eyes landed on a photograph he had left out on the desk, the photograph of Antonio and Marco. She squinted at it, tilted her head, and pointed one small finger. "This one," she said. "This one is very kind." Alessandro looked up sharply. Her finger was resting on Marco's face. "You know Uncle Marco?" he asked, keeping his voice as light as he could. Emma nodded seriously. "Uncle Marco gives me candies," she said, "the strawberry ones. And he tells me stories about when he and Uncle Ale were little, about the time you got stuck up a tree and he had to climb up and get you down, and the time you both fell in the fountain at the wedding." Alessandro sat very still. He had never told a living soul either of those stories. Not once, in 12 years. "Uncle Marco visits you?" he asked slowly. "Sometimes," she said. "When Mama is hanging up the laundry, he always says hello. He asks if I'm being good. He says I look like Mama." Alessandro felt something in his chest that he could not name. Marco, the man he had spent 11 days building a case against, had been quietly, in secret, keeping an eye on the child of the housekeeper, bringing her candies, telling her stories only Alessandro should have known. He looked away for a moment, toward the dark window. He was not certain what his face was doing. Then Emma spoke again, in the same calm little voice, and the room changed. "But the man in the black suit isn't nice, Uncle Ale." He turned back to her slowly. She had reached for a different photograph, the group portrait taken at the family gathering the previous Christmas. 22 men in dark suits, standing in formal rows on the front steps of the mansion. She was pointing to the second row, on the left, to a smooth, quiet face standing just behind Don Vittorio's shoulder, Luca Ricci. "The other night," Emma said, kicking her small legs, "I saw him. He went into your dressing room, in the nighttime. When it was dark, Alessandro's entire body went cold. Not the cold of fear, the cold of a man who has just heard the first true sentence in a very long time. "When did you see him, sweetheart?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. Emma tilted her head, thinking. "The night Mama and I went to get the laundry." Alessandro slid off his chair and knelt on the carpet in front of hers. He did not want to loom over her. He did not want to frighten her. Not now. Not for the world. "Emma," he said gently. "Sweetheart, I need you to tell me exactly what happened that night, everything you remember. Can you do that for Uncle Ale?" Emma nodded, very serious. She hugged Mr. Buttons a little tighter against her chest. Mama got out of bed, she said, because she forgot the laundry basket. She said the wet clothes would go all bad if she left them until morning. I was awake too because I had a bad dream about the shadow behind the closet. So I said I wanted to come. Mama said okay, but I had to be quiet like a mouse. What time was it? He asked softly. She thought about it. The little hand was on the 2, and the big hand was on the 12. Mama showed me. She said, "Look, Emma, it's 2 o'clock. That means we have to be extra quiet. 2 in the morning." Alessandro nodded slowly. Then what happened? We went to get the basket from the back porch, and then Mama went to put it in the laundry room, but I saw a light, under a door. So I peeked, because I wanted to see. Which door? Sweetheart, the room with all your shirts, Uncle Ale. The one you don't let anybody go in. His private dressing room, the room only he and Sophia had a key to. The room where his clothes for the week were pressed and hung the night before by Sophia herself. And who did you see inside? Emma pointed once again at the group photograph on his desk. Her finger did not waver, the man in the black suit. He was sitting at the little table. He had one of your white shirts in his hands. He had a little pair of scissors, not big ones, tiny ones, like the kind Mama uses for cutting my fingernails. He was cutting the shirt very carefully, just at the top, right here. She touched the collar of her own nightgown. And then he took something very small out of his pocket. It was black, like a little tiny piece of a domino. And he put it inside the shirt. And then he was sewing. He was sewing very fast, like Mama sews the buttons back on my dresses. Alessandro did not move. He did not breathe. He saw me, Emma went on, in a smaller voice now. He looked up and he saw me at the door, and I got scared. I thought he was going to be mad, but he just smiled. And he put his finger on his mouth like this. She raised one small finger and pressed it to her lips, and he said, "Shh, little one. This is a secret game. You mustn't tell anyone. Not Mama, not Uncle Ale, nobody, or the game will be spoiled." And he winked, and I was so scared, Uncle Ale. I ran back to Mama, and I never told anyone, because he said the game would be spoiled. She looked up at him with enormous worried eyes. Did I do a bad thing? Alessandro closed his eyes for one long moment. When he opened them, his hand was on her cheek, gentle as the brush of a feather. "No, sweetheart," he said, his voice rough. "You did a very, very brave thing. You just told Uncle Ale the most important secret in the whole world," he remembered. The very next morning, the morning after that night, he had reached into his dressing room and pulled out the white shirt he was to wear to the meeting of the 5 great families. The white shirt with a memory card sewn into its collar, waiting to be found. Waiting to point at Marco. The traitor was not Marco Rossi. The traitor was Luca Ricci, the smooth, quiet man who had stood one step behind Don Vittorio's shoulder for 5 long years. The man who had counted the family's money. The man whose voice had said, so gently, "Don Alessandro, the evidence is beyond doubt." Alessandro rose to his feet. He kissed the top of Emma's head once, quickly, and walked out of the study. He needed proof. Proof so absolute that not one man in the entire family could question it. He would not act on the word of a 5-year-old, no matter how brave. He needed something no one could argue with. He found Rico in the corridor. Every camera in the private wing, every recording from the last 30 days. "Bring me everything, now." Rico moved instantly. 90 minutes later, the technical team returned to the study. Their faces were pale. Enzo, the young Sicilian, spoke first, his voice tight. "Sir, all of them. Every single camera. The footage from that entire night, it's been altered. Someone has run it through an AI reconstruction. The original files are gone." Alessandro did not raise his voice. He did not even turn around from the tall window where he stood. "Can it be recovered?" Enzo hesitated. "The original data. Perhaps. It depends on how the overwrite was done. If they used a standard AI reconstruction and simply layered the falsified footage on top of the raw feed, then somewhere in the archive server, the original blocks may still exist as ghost data. But it will take time, sir. 12 hours, maybe more. And I would need Petrov the hacker, not our Rico, the Russian. He is the only one who can do it fast enough." "Get him," Alessandro said. "Tonight. Pay him whatever he asks." "Yes, sir." Enzo left. Rico remained. Alessandro turned then, and Rico saw his face and understood, without a single word being spoken, that everything had changed. "The elders will vote against me by the end of the week," Alessandro said quietly. "Don Vittorio has already prepared the ground. If I move against Luca now, without absolute proof, Half the family will believe I am protecting a traitor at the cost of the entire house. Luca has spent years poisoning them against Marco. Anything I say against Luca now, they will hear as the raving of a coward. Then how, sir? Alessandro walked to his desk. He looked down at the old photograph of Antonio and Marco. He touched the edge of it with one finger. We give him what he wants, he said. We give the elders their execution. We give Luca his victory. We stage it, publicly, in the great hall. Every capo present, every soldier, every elder. And Luca will be so certain of his triumph that he will not be careful. He will slip. He will show himself. And when he does, every man in the family will see it happen with his own eyes. Rico was silent for a long moment. You are asking Marco to walk into his own execution as bait. Yes, he does not know he is bait. No. If your plan fails, sir, you will kill the most loyal man you have ever known with your own hand, in front of the entire family. Alessandro looked up. His eyes were completely without warmth. Then it must not fail. The order went out at dawn. By 10 in the morning, Marco Rossi had been arrested at his apartment in Manhattan. He had not resisted. He had not spoken. He had simply looked at the two capos who had come to take him, men who had once called him brother and had held out his wrists to be bound. By noon, the great hall of the Moretti mansion had been prepared. The long refectory table had been pushed against the wall. Chairs had been arranged in a wide arc. Every capo, every lieutenant, every senior soldier of the Moretti family, more than 50 men in all, had been summoned to witness the trial of the traitor. Sofia and Emma were placed, at Alessandro's personal insistence, in the safe room behind the library, a small windowless chamber with a steel door, guarded by two of Rico's most trusted men. Sofia held her daughter's hand and did not ask any of the questions burning in her chest. At 2 o'clock, the doors of the great hall opened. Marco Rossi was walked in between two soldiers, his hands tied behind his back, his shoulders straight. His shirt was open at the collar. His face was calm. He looked once around the hall at all the men he had served beside for 12 years, and none of them would meet his eyes. He was made to kneel on the marble floor at the center of the ark. Alessandro stepped forward from the far end of the hall. In his hand, drawn from the leather holster at his hip, was the golden beretta, the pistol that had belonged to his father and to his brother before him, the symbol of the head of the house. It had been fired only 3 times in Alessandro's life, and each time, a family had ended. He walked until he stood 3 paces from Marco. He raised the golden pistol, level with Marco's forehead. Somewhere behind the arc of capos, in the deep shadow of the far pillars, Luca Ricci stood watching. His face was solemn. His hands were folded. His eyes were quietly, terribly bright. Marco Rossi, Alessandro said. His voice carried through the great hall. Do you have anything to say? Marco lifted his head. He looked at Alessandro, at the man he had walked 1 step behind for 12 years, at the man he had taken a bullet for, at the man he had called brother in the dark of the Brooklyn warehouse, and he smiled, a small, sad, tired smile. If you believe I have betrayed you, brother, he said quietly, then pull the trigger. The silence in the great hall was absolute. 50 men held their breath. The old grandfather clock at the far wall marked 1 slow, heavy second, then another, then another. Alessandro's finger settled against the trigger of the golden beretta. The muzzle was steady. The angle was correct. In the whole hall, the only movement was the faint drift of dust through the wide beam of sunlight that fell across the marble floor between the 2 men, between the ruler of the Moretti family and the man kneeling at his feet. Alessandro looked into Marco's eyes. Marco did not look away. 12 years, Alessandro thought. 12 years, and this is where we stand. His finger tightened by the smallest fraction of a millimeter, and in that fraction of a second, the smallest possible sliver of time before a life ends, the great double doors of the hall burst open. A small figure ran into the room. She was wearing her pink nightgown, though it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Her feet were bare, her hair was wild from running, and she was clutching, against her small chest with both arms, a green stuffed rabbit, not Mr. Buttons, but a newer toy. Alessandro had bought her only that week, one she had refused to leave anywhere without. Emma. Behind her, Sofia burst through the doors a moment later, her face white with terror, both hands reaching out to catch her daughter. 2 of Rico's guards followed at a run, their faces stricken with the panic of men who had failed at the most important job of their lives. Emma, Sofia gasped. Emma, come here, sweetheart. Come here to Mama. But Emma had already stopped in the middle of the hall. She had frozen there, in the center of the great arc of dark suits, her small chest rising and falling. She had seen Uncle Ale standing tall with something shiny in his hand. She had seen the man on his knees on the floor, and her enormous dark eyes had gone very wide and very confused. "Uncle Marco?" she whispered. Marco Rossi, kneeling on the marble, blinked once. Very slowly, he turned his head. He saw the little girl, and something in his face, the face that had been calm and resigned and ready to die a heartbeat before, cracked in a way that no man in that hall had ever seen it crack. "Little one," he breathed. "What are you?" But Emma was no longer looking at him. Her small brown eyes had moved past him, past the Arc of Capos, past Don Vittorio in his high-backed chair, into the deep shadow of the pillars at the far side of the hall. Where Luca Ricci stood, she stared at him for one long moment. And then, very slowly, without any hesitation at all, she raised her small finger and pointed straight at him. "The man in the black suit," she said. Her voice was clear as a small silver bell. It carried through the entire silent hall. "The man in the black suit is not nice, Uncle Ale." Alessandro did not lower the gun. He did not turn his head. He simply held perfectly still. "The other night," Emma said, in the calm, bright voice of a 5-year-old, telling a story she had rehearsed to herself many times, "I saw him. He took Uncle Ale's shirt, the white one. He was in the room with all the shirts, in the nighttime, when it was dark." Every single head in the hall turned toward Luca Ricci. 50 men, 4 capos, 3 elders, all of them, at exactly the same moment, turned their bodies toward the tall, shadowed figure in the second row. Luca Ricci did not move. Emma went on, oblivious to the storm she had just unleashed. She was hugging her green rabbit and swaying slightly on her small bare feet, the way children do when they are telling something important. "He was cutting the shirt with little scissors," she said, "right at the top, right here. And then he put something inside. Something black. Something very small. And then he sewed the shirt back up, very fast, like Mama sews." She tilted her head, thinking, remembering, "And he saw me, and he winked at me, and he put his finger on his mouth, like this." She pressed her small finger to her lips, and he said, "Shh. This is a secret game. Don't tell Uncle Ale, or the game will be spoiled." The great hall went utterly, completely silent. Alessandro lowered the golden beretta, slowly, 1 inch at a time, until the muzzle pointed at the marble floor. Then, just as slowly, he turned his head and looked at Luca Ricci with eyes the color of ice at the bottom of a river. Luca Ricci recovered faster than most men would have. He was, after all, a professional. He stepped forward from the shadow of the pillar. His hands were spread in a small, apologetic gesture. His voice was soft, reasonable, faintly amused, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this exact moment more than once. "Don Alessandro." He smiled the careful smile of a servant addressing a beloved master. "With the greatest respect, the child is confused. She is 5 years old. She has been through a very frightening morning. Perhaps she saw one of the household staff in a dark coat and remembered it wrong. Perhaps she is repeating something she overheard. Children, you know how children are." He gave a small, indulgent laugh. It landed in the silent hall like a stone dropped down a well. "Surely we are not going to overturn 12 years of investigation on the word of one small girl." Alessandro did not answer. He did not move the muzzle of the golden beretta. He did not blink. He simply lifted one hand, a small, precise motion, and made a single gesture toward the doors at the back of the hall. The doors opened. A quiet man in a dark suit walked in, carrying a slim black laptop under one arm. He was thin, with pale eyes and pale hair and the kind of face people never quite remembered afterwards. Alessandro had introduced him to no one. Only Rico knew his name, and Rico had known him for 5 years. The hacker walked past the arc of stunned capos. He walked past the kneeling Marco. He walked past Emma, who had by now retreated backward into her mother's arms and was watching the great scene unfold with enormous, solemn eyes. He stopped beside Alessandro and set the laptop on the small side table that had been prepared for exactly this purpose. "Sir," he said quietly, "we recovered the original footage. Before the AI overwrite, it took us 11 hours, but it is complete." From above, a large projection screen descended slowly from the coffered ceiling of the great hall. The lights along the walls dimmed to half. 50 men turned in their chairs to face the screen. The hacker pressed a single key. The screen flickered, and then, in high-resolution color, the empty dressing room of Alessandro Moretti appeared, time-stamped 2:03 in the morning, 16 nights earlier. For a long moment, nothing happened. The room was still. The row of white shirts hung in silent order. Then the door opened. Luca Ricci walked in. He walked carefully, quietly, with the practiced calm of a man who had done this many times. He crossed to the row of shirts, ran his fingers along them, and selected one, the third from the left, the one Alessandro was scheduled to wear the following morning. He carried it to the small dressing table. He sat down. He drew a tiny pair of embroidery scissors from his inside jacket pocket, and a small paper packet, and a spool of thread that had clearly been chosen to match the collar precisely. With the delicate concentration of a jeweler, Luca opened the seam at the base of the collar. He extracted a small black object from the paper packet, a micro SD card, unmistakable even at this distance, and slid it into the pocket of fabric he had just made. Then he threaded his needle and began, with fast expert stitches, to close the collar again. The image was crystal clear. There could be no mistake. In the great hall, no one breathed. And then, at the very end, as Luca stood up and adjusted the shirt back onto its hanger with a small satisfied pat, he glanced up, straight at the camera he thought he had already disabled. He smiled a small, cold, private smile, and he raised one hand and turned off the recording. The screen went black. The lights in the hall came back up. Marco Rossi, still kneeling on the marble floor at the center of the ark, his hands still bound behind his back, slowly lifted his head. His face, which had been perfectly composed all through his own trial, crumpled. For the first time in 12 years, tears rolled down the face of the man who had once taken a bullet meant for Alessandro's heart. Alessandro turned. Slowly, deliberately, he raised the golden beretta again, but this time, the muzzle did not point at Marco. It pointed at Luca Ricci. "You," Alessandro said, his voice very quiet, very cold, "used my own shirt to destroy the brother I trusted most." Luca Ricci stared at the black screen for a long moment. His shoulders were still, his hands were still, his face, the smooth, composed, careful face he had worn for 20 years, did not move. And then something behind his eyes broke. It was not fear. It was not shame. It was something far older and far uglier. It was the ugly relief of a man who has been holding a lie so heavy, for so many years, that he no longer minds being crushed by it so long as he does not have to carry it one more day. He began to laugh. The sound was low at first, a dry, bitter chuckle in the back of his throat. Then it climbed. It became a real laugh, jagged, breathless, and utterly wrong for the room. It went on for perhaps 5 seconds. Every man in the great hall watched him laugh with a growing horror in their guts. Then he stopped, quite suddenly, and looked around the arc of stunned faces with something almost like affection. "Yes," he said. His voice was different now, lighter, almost cheerful. "Yes, it was me. All of it. Every last piece of it. Was me." He spread his hands, a small showman's gesture. 4 years, he said. 4 years, gentlemen. I have been walking through this house with a knife tucked under my tongue. 4 years. I have counted your money and smiled at your faces and listened to your stupid conversations about honor and family and omertà. 4 years. I have been feeding this entire empire, one drop at a time, into the mouth of Don Salvatore Bruno. A ripple of movement passed through the arc of capos. Hands went to jackets. Rico Petrov took one long step forward, but Alessandro raised his free hand, the one not holding the golden beretta, and Rico stopped. "Let him speak," Alessandro said quietly. Luca smiled at him. It was a smile without warmth of any kind. $20 million, he said. "That is what the Bruno family paid me to build the beautiful little frame around Marco Rossi. 20 million, plus a promotion once he was dead. Consigliere, chief financial voice of the entire Moretti house. From that seat, I would have opened every vault, every route, every account, every safe house, and delivered them to Don Bruno like Christmas presents. And then, once you had nothing left, Don Alessandro, once the Moretti name was a hollow shell, I would have delivered you as well. And I would have walked into Bruno's court as his second in command. A prince." The old elder Don Vittorio, in his high-backed chair, made a small choking sound. "The warehouse in New Jersey," Luca went on, ticking the items off on his fingers with a strange, dreamy pleasure. "That was me. I sent the location to a friend at the bureau who owes me favors. The arms shipment at the Canadian border, me. Wrong route slipped into Marco's briefing folder. The recordings on the memory card, a talented voice actor in Queens. 3 months of work. The bank account in the Caymans opened in Marco's name, with forged signatures I have been practicing for years. Every piece. Every one." He glanced down at Marco, still kneeling on the marble. "You were meant to die today, Marco. Right there, on that floor. I have imagined it many, many times." Marco did not lift his head. His shoulders shook once. "And Vincenzo?" Alessandro said, his voice deadly quiet. His most trusted man? Luca's smile widened. Vincenzo asked questions he was not supposed to ask. About my travel expenses. About some numbers that did not add up. He was going to come to Marco with what he had found. So I met him in a parking lot in Queens, and I put 2 bullets behind his ear, and I buried him myself under 14 feet of concrete beneath the new expressway extension. He is holding up a road, Don Alessandro. That is his tomb. Sophia, at the back of the hall, made a soft broken sound and pulled Emma's face into her shoulder to cover the child's ears. And then, Luca said, almost gently, once dear Marco was cold in the ground. And I sat at your right hand as consigliere. I would have had 4 to 6 months, I estimated, to complete the last step. A small accident. Perhaps an aneurysm in your sleep. Perhaps a shooting on the way out of a restaurant. Poetic, no? Same restaurant where Antonio died. I had already picked the table. A low sound rose in the throats of the capos, the sound of 50 men understanding, all at once, exactly how close their entire empire had come to being handed over to the enemy without a single shot fired. Luca inhaled softly. He looked around the great hall one last time. His eyes traveled slowly across the stunned faces, the capos, the elders, Marco, Alessandro, and then drifted, almost as an afterthought, toward the back of the hall, toward Sophia, toward the small pink figure clutched in Sophia's arms, toward Emma. And when his eyes settled on the little girl, something in them changed. It was not madness this time. It was something colder, something calculating, something profoundly, terribly awake. It happened faster than any man in the hall could react. Luca Ricci had been standing very still for perhaps 4 seconds. His hands had been visible. His posture had been almost relaxed. 50 men had been staring at him. Every one of them thought he was finished. They were wrong. Luca Ricci had spent 4 years planning for the exact moment when everything would fall apart, and a man who has planned for such a moment does not carry only one weapon. His right hand moved, not toward his shoulder holster, where every man in the room had already assumed his weapon lived, toward the small of his back, beneath the tail of his tailored jacket, where a compact black pistol had been sitting against his spine for 4 years and had never once been used. Before Alessandro could shout a warning, before Rico could raise his gun, before any of the 50 armed men in the hall could move, Luca was already running. Not toward the doors, toward Sophia. He crossed the marble floor in 6 long strides. Sophia, holding Emma against her shoulder with both arms, saw him coming, and her whole body turned to shield the child on pure animal instinct. It was not enough. Luca did not go for Sophia. He reached around her, hooked his left arm around the small pink shape of Emma's waist, and tore her out of her mother's grasp in a single violent motion. Sophia screamed. The sound that came out of her was not a word. It was not a name. It was the pure sound a mother makes when the world takes her child from her arms, an animal sound, from a place older than language. Luca stepped back 3 paces. Emma dangled from his left arm like a doll, her small bare feet kicking, her enormous eyes wide with a terror so complete she could not make a sound. The black pistol appeared in his right hand. He pressed the muzzle, precisely, gently, against the side of her small temple. "Everybody back," he shouted. His voice cracked through the great hall like a whip. "Everybody back. Do not move, or she dies." Emma began to cry, not the loud crying of a frightened child, the small, choking, breathless crying of a child who has understood, on some terrible instinctive level, that this is a game she may not survive. Her 2 small hands rose. They wrapped, trembling, around the cold forearm of the man who was holding her, the way she might have held on to her mother. Sophia lunged. 2 guards caught her from behind, one at each arm, and it took the full weight of both grown men to keep her from throwing herself into the line of fire. She collapsed between them, on her knees, sobbing. "Emma, Emma, my baby, please, please don't hurt her. Please, take me instead. Take me, take me." Alessandro Moretti stood absolutely still. His right hand still held the golden beretta. His arm was frozen at his side. He had not moved a single muscle since the moment Luca had touched Emma. Somewhere in the room, 40 guns had come up as one, a low, deadly ripple of steel drawn from 40 holsters, and every one of them was trained on Luca. Not one of them dared to fire, because Emma's temple was against the muzzle of Luca's pistol, because a 5-year-old's skull is very small, and a professional's grip is very tight, and the smallest twitch of a nervous finger would carry a bullet through the wrong body. For 8 years, Alessandro Moretti had been the man who gave the order. His men had waited on his voice for their lives. They waited for it now. The order did not come. His mouth was open. His throat would not work. His hand, the hand that held the golden pistol, was shaking. Not with rage, with fear. He had not felt fear like this since he had knelt in his brother's blood 8 years ago. He had sworn to himself that he would never feel it again. He was feeling it now. Luca began to move. Slowly, one careful step at a time, backwards, toward the great arched doorway of the hall. Emma hanging from his arm, the pistol against her temple, his eyes darting from face to face, watching for any man foolish enough to try a shot. "Prepare a car," he said. His voice was almost calm again. "Open the gates. If anyone follows, if anyone lifts a weapon after I leave, I put a bullet through her head and I mail you what is left. Am I understood, Don Alessandro? Am I understood?" 40 men held 40 guns. None of them fired. Emma was too close. Alessandro Moretti did the thing he had never done in his entire life. He surrendered. Slowly, one aching inch at a time, he lowered the golden beretta until the muzzle pointed at the marble floor. His hand was shaking so violently that the polished barrel caught the light in little flickering spots. "Do not harm her," he said, his voice barely carried across the hall. "Do not harm her, Luca. I will let you go. The gates will open. The road will be clear. Only do not harm her." Luca smiled. He tilted his head to one side, appraising Alessandro like a curious child studying a broken toy. "Well," he murmured. Well, so this is the price of the great Don Moretti after all. One small girl in a pink nightgown." He began to move again. Backwards. 1 step, 2, Emma still hanging from his left arm, the pistol still pressed against her small temple. The great arched doorway of the hall stood open behind him. Beyond it, the wide marble corridor. Beyond that, the front doors of the mansion, already unlocked at Rico's silent gesture. Beyond that, the granite steps down to the driveway, where one of the black cars was already being pulled around. The 40 guards moved with him. They matched him pace for pace, weapons up, faces stone. None of them fired. No one dared. Emma was still crying, a soft, hopeless little sound now, her cheek pressed into the shoulder of the man who might kill her. Marco Rossi had not risen from his knees. Every eye in the hall was on Luca. Every gun in the hall was on Luca. And so no one, not one of the 50 men in that room, was looking at the bound man kneeling in the middle of the marble floor as the whole procession moved past him. Marco was watching, very carefully. He was watching the way Luca held the child, the way Luca's weight shifted with each backward step, the way the rope around Marco's own wrists, the rope his 2 former brothers had tied that morning, had been knotted in the traditional Sicilian fashion, and left, in the arrogance of certainty, just a little longer than it ought to have been. Marco began, very slowly, to work his wrists apart. The procession moved out through the arched doorway, down the marble corridor, toward the great front doors. Alessandro walked at the head of the guards, 3 paces behind Luca, his empty hand raised. His eyes never left Emma's small, terrified face. They reached the front doors. The doors opened. The bright afternoon sunlight spilled across the marble threshold. Beyond it, the wide granite steps descended toward the drive. Luca stepped out onto the top step. There, for a single half-second, he had to look behind him. He had to gauge the distance to the car. He had to make certain no vehicle would block his path. He turned his head, just slightly, just enough to see the driveway over his own shoulder. And in that half-second, he pushed Emma out in front of him, a shield of soft skin and pink cotton, and lowered his own head behind hers. That was the moment Marco moved. He had freed his hands somewhere in the corridor. No one had seen it happen. He came from the left side, out of the shadow of the great front doors, silent and unbelievably fast. In his hands he carried the length of rope that had bound his wrists. He wrapped it around Luca's throat in a single, vicious motion, and hauled backward with every ounce of the 12 years of muscle he had built at Alessandro's side. Luca made a strangled, gargling sound. His head snapped back. His feet came off the step. He crashed onto the granite on his back, and Emma tumbled out of his arm and rolled once on the top step like a small pink ball. The pistol fired. The bullet went wide of everything it had been aimed at and buried itself, at close range, through Marco Rossi's left shoulder, the exact same shoulder, the exact same place. The scar that had been carrying 5 years of memory took a second bullet in the same square inch of flesh. Marco grunted. He did not let go of the rope. Alessandro was already moving. He crossed the top of the steps in 2 long strides, scooped Emma up against his chest with one arm, and turned his back to shield her body with his own. Luca, choking, half-conscious, half-mad, twisted on the granite. His pistol came up. His arm swung, blind, wild. The muzzle found Alessandro's back. His finger tightened on the trigger. He never pulled it. 40 guns fired at once. The sound was not 40 separate shots. It was one enormous roar, as if the mansion itself had opened its throat and screamed. Luca Ricci's body jerked once against the granite, then again, and then lay very still on the top step precisely, exactly, on the same square of stone where he had been planning to leave Marco Rossi's body 10 minutes earlier. 4 years of patience, of careful murder, of buried men and forged signatures and small night visits to a locked dressing room, ended in the exact tableau he had spent those 4 years designing for another man. Marco Rossi did not die on the granite steps of the Moretti mansion. The ambulance reached him within 7 minutes. The bullet had passed cleanly through the muscle of his left shoulder, missed the artery by less than half an inch, and lodged itself in the wooden frame of the front door behind him. By the time the surgeons at Mount Sinai were closing the wound, Marco was already awake, already asking, in a voice hoarse from the rope burn on his throat, whether the little girl was safe. Alessandro sat by his bedside that night. For a long time, neither man spoke. Then Alessandro leaned forward and rested his forehead very gently against the forehead of the man he had almost killed with his own hand, and said the 2 words he had never said to anyone in his entire adult life. "Forgive me." Marco did not answer with words. He simply lifted his uninjured arm and wrapped it around the back of Alessandro's neck, the way an older brother holds a younger one, and the 2 of them, 2 hard men, who had between them killed and buried, and never wept, sat there and cried, like 2 small boys who had lost each other in a crowd, and finally found each other again. Later, Marco managed a weak smile through the pain. "If it hadn't been for Emma," he whispered, "I think I would have died on your marble floor, brother. And you would have carried that for the rest of your life." "I know," Alessandro said quietly. "I know I would have." 6 months passed. The pale house on the hill was no longer the same house. The long echoing hallways were no longer silent. Somewhere in the mansion, at any hour of the day, you could now hear the sound of a child running, or laughing, or calling for someone at the top of her small, strong voice. The cook had begun keeping a jar of strawberry candies in the kitchen. Rico Petrov had learned how to braid a little girl's hair, badly, and then well. Sofia Ramirez no longer worked as a housekeeper. Alessandro had moved her and Emma out of the small cottage and into a proper wing of the main house, 3 rooms, sunlit, with a view of the garden. She managed the household staff now, though she still stubbornly insisted on making Emma's breakfast with her own 2 hands. Alessandro had opened a scholarship fund for the children of every soldier and every worker in the Moretti family. He had quietly bought a piece of land in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Queens and built a small, free preschool on it, with bright yellow walls and a garden shaped like a heart. Above the door, in careful iron letters, hung the name he had chosen for it, the Emma Foundation. Marco Rossi had healed. He walked with a slight stiffness in the left shoulder now, but he stood, as he had for 12 years, 1 step behind Alessandro's right side. He had also, at Emma's own tearful request, become her official godfather, and had cried harder at the ceremony than any grown man in the church. Emma had, somewhere along the way, stopped calling Alessandro Uncle Ale. She called him Papa Ale now. She had begun one morning and never stopped. And Alessandro Moretti, the man who had once ordered the deaths of 11 men, the man who had once believed love was the most expensive weakness a person could carry, had never once corrected her. On a warm evening in early autumn, 6 months to the day after the trial in the Great Hall, the 3 of them sat down together at the long dining table, Sofia, Alessandro, and Emma between them. Marco was there too, at Alessandro's right, laughing at something Sofia had said. It was the small everyday sound of a family. Nothing about it was rare. Everything about it was a miracle. Alessandro reached down and lifted Emma up into his lap. She curled into him the way she had learned to over the months, 1 small hand pressed against his chest, right over the place where the cold stone had once lived. "Emma," he said softly, "do you think you got that shirt properly clean, that day in the bathroom?" Emma tilted her small head, thinking about it with great seriousness. Then she shook it slowly. "I don't think so, Papa Ale." It was still a little bit dirty at the bottom. Alessandro pulled her close against him. His voice, when it came, was rough with the effort of holding something enormous inside it. "No, sweetheart, you didn't just clean the shirt that day. You cleaned the whole Moretti family, in an empire built of blood and gunpowder and cold marble. A 5-year-old girl with red hands and a soaking pink nightgown had taught the most feared man in New York a lesson no war had ever managed to teach him, that the greatest wealth in a person's life is not measured in gold, or in power, or in the size of the house they sleep in. It is measured in the number of hearts that love them without asking for anything in return. That kindness is not weakness. That trust, given carefully, is not folly. That sometimes the smallest hands in the room are the ones holding up the whole world. That the man who cannot be reached by threats and cannot be moved by money can still, sometimes, be undone by a child asking, "Please don't send my mother away." Dear friends, thank you so much for staying with us all the way to the end of this story. If Emma's courage, Sophia's quiet strength, or the healing of Alessandro's frozen heart touched you tonight, please take one small moment to hit the like button, share this video with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story. Every subscription is a small candle you light for us, and it helps us bring more heartfelt stories to you every single day. We would love, so very much, to hear from you in the comments. What did this story make you feel? Did any part of it remind you of someone in your own life? A mother who carried you alone? A child who taught you what really matters? A friend you almost lost through a misunderstanding? Have you ever had a moment when a small act of kindness changed everything you believed about the world? Please tell us. Every comment is read. Every story matters. Your words might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear tonight. And to every single one of you watching this, wherever you are in the world, whatever kind of day you have had, we wish you good health, peace in your home, warmth in your heart, and gentle joy in every ordinary day ahead. May your family be safe. May your loved ones be near. And may you always, always remember that even the smallest hands in the room can hold up the whole world. Thank you for listening. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next story.